The conservation room at Kensington Palace on a quiet winter morning in early 1997 held its breath. Beneath a directed halogen beam, light fractured through a cushion-cut Colombian emerald, deep saturated music, green, the precise color of old forest after heavy rain. A white-gloved conservator's hand steadied the choker against its velvet rest, the gold setting catching warmth with the patience of very old metal. The piece appeared in Spencer Estate correspondence dated that year, noted simply as personal property. Not crown collection, not an institutional loan, not borrowed ceremony. Diana had fastened this clasp herself in the years following the separation, with no lady-in-waiting present, no formal protocol to observe. She wore it to official engagements as though it were ordinary. Music it was not. The emeralds did not announce themselves. They argued quietly and in music public. She did not wear them to be seen. She wore them to be understood. Subscribe, if you want, to the documented history behind the jewels Diana chose to keep and the palace tried to reclaim. The emerald tradition in the British royal collection runs deep, predating Diana's arrival by generations. The Cambridge Emeralds, a suite of Colombian stones tracing their lineage through the Cambridge branch of the extended royal family, entered Queen Mary's possession during the early 20th century as part of her systematic consolidation of dynastic jewelry. Queen Mary, who catalogued acquisitions with the precision of a curator rather than the pleasure of a collector, documented the emerald's arrival with characteristic care. The stones were deep green, exceptional in their clarity, set in configurations that communicated the Edwardian court's preference for layered opulence. Weight made visible, wealth made portable. By the formal engagement of Lady Diana Spencer to Charles, Prince of Wales, announced at Buckingham Palace on February 24, 1981, the Cambridge Emeralds had been in the royal or state duchess's collection for decades. Music, they sat within a classification system the palace had refined but never entirely codified. Crown property, personal inheritance, and pieces loaned for formal ceremony. Music, a Princess of Wales would have access to all three categories, an arrangement carrying from the beginning a purposeful ambiguity about what access meant in practice. Diana Music was introduced to the collection's emerald holdings early in her years as princess. Music, the stones were made available for appropriate occasions. The word appropriate carried institutional weight. It implied an understanding about how the pieces would be used, what occasions they would mark, and implicitly that the relationship between wearer and jewel was one of stewardship rather than ownership. Court circular records from this period note her early appearances in pieces from the collection without specifying the terms of their use. Not all gifts are freely given. Some are offered with the expectation of return, written invisibly into the clasp. The question of whether a piece of jewelry belongs to a queen or to the crown she represents is one of the oldest unresolved tensions in the history of royal adornment. By established British convention, music, the distinction rested on a straightforward principle. Jewelry given to the institution was crown property. Jewelry given directly to the individual as a personal diplomatic gift or family inheritance music was personal. In practice, the line had always been more convenient to ignore than to enforce. During royal tour to the Gulf states in the 1980s, Diana received emerald and diamond pieces of significant value from foreign heads of state. Among the most thoroughly documented in subsequent estate records music was an emerald and diamond suite of considerable value, given on behalf of the Saudi royal family. The exact configuration recorded in Spencer Estate probate music documentation, though the full inventory has not been made publicly available. Garrard and Company, the crown jewelers throughout this period, held service records indicating pieces from her collection were examined and adjusted following receipt. The stones associated with the Saudi gift were of considerable quality, the settings formal in their construction and designed for the visual weight required at state functions. The palace's interest in how Diana wore such pieces was immediate. Diplomatic gifts, once photographed on a Princess of Wales, entered the visual record of the monarchy. Whether they were her stones or the institution's image was a question left deliberately unanswered. The difference between a loan and a gift is everything, unless both parties find ambiguity more convenient than clarity. Emeralds had served as diplomatic currency in the British royal wardrobe long before Diana fastened her first clasp. Queen Alexandra wore emerald suites presented during imperial Tour, Queen Mary accumulated Columbian stones with determined thoroughness, viewing each acquisition as a small act of dynastic consolidation. The color itself carried connotations the court understood: green for hope, for prosperity, for the particular confidence of an institution that had been absorbing extravagance for centuries without requiring justification. Diana learned to speak that language with considerable fluency. The press photography from her solo international tour between 1983 and 1992 reveals a consistent pattern. The emerald pieces appear most prominently when she traveled unaccompanied. Music, at official state engagements in Washington in November 1985, at charity functions in London during the publicly difficult years of the early 1990s, the green music, stones are present, catching light, declaring themselves. Portrait sittings documented between 1985 and 1992 show the emeralds appearing at intervals that correspond with striking consistency to periods of institutional tension in the Wales marriage. Whether this alignment was calculated or coincidental remains genuinely open. Some biographers argue she wore what was available. Others maintain, as the photographic and chronological record supports, that she exercised considerable intentionality in her selections. Biographers and fashion historians who later studied her wardrobe records consistently noted music, the same pattern. The jewelry choices functioned as a deliberate language, each selection a form of statement made without words. The portrait record does not resolve the debate. It simply shows again and again the same green stones at the same chosen moments, worn not at family occasions or coronations, but at engagements Diana attended alone, in rooms where the clasp was hers to fasten. She chose green when she had something to say. On the evening of November 9th, Music, 1985, Diana arrived at a state dinner hosted by President Ronald Reagan and First Lady Nancy Reagan at the White House. She wore a midnight blue Victor Edelstein gown, later documented in Christie's June 1997 auction catalog, and at her throat an emerald and diamond choker in deep green stones set in diamond-bordered gold. The piece's precise provenance, whether from the Cambridge suite or her collection of Saudi-gifted emerald music jewelry, has never been definitively resolved in the public record. The East Room's chandeliers fractured through the stones with particular intensity, the green catching against the diplomatic whites and blacks of the surrounding assembly, with an effect that press photographers described as commanding. Within days, the image had appeared on front pages across 3 continents. Royal household protocol for state events of this level traditionally called for pieces communicating institutional continuity rather than personal assertion. Tiara, pearls, the visible grammar of an established monarchy. Diana met the formal requirements and exceeded them, selecting stones of considerably greater visual force than convention music, strictly demanded. Whether this constituted a deliberate departure from music, the institutional language, or a confident use of available pieces, no official record adjudicates. The Lord Chamberlain's office issued no guidance on the choice. The palace offered no public comment. Photographic evidence from the evening documents, Diana moving through the East Room with the choker catching light at each turn, the stones visible from across the chamber. Press accounts from the following morning described her appearance in terms ordinarily reserved for coronations rather than working state dinners. Whether this outcome was anticipated or simply permitted to unfold was a question the palace chose not to address. Protocol is a kind of silence imposed from outside. The silence in this case spoke with considerable clarity. The emerald and diamond suite associated with the Saudi royal family stands as one of the most carefully documented and carefully contested elements of Diana's personal jewelry archive. The suite, received during what most sources identify as Gulf tour visits in the mid-1980s, was recorded in Spencer estate probate documents as personal property, a direct gift to Diana, not held on behalf of the crown. This classification had legal weight. Diplomatic gifts given directly to a member of the royal family, rather than to the institution, were personal under prevailing convention. The palace had always preferred that convention remain unexamined. Andrew Morton's interviews with Diana, secretly recorded in 1991 music, and first published in June 1992 during her lifetime, documented her awareness that her jewelry collection was a form of contested territory, that pieces photographed on a Princess of Wales entered a visual record the palace considered in some sense its own. A revised edition incorporating the full transcripts appeared in 1997 after her death. Morton recorded Diana as precise about the distinction between what she owned and what she wore on behalf of the institution. The Saudi suite sat clearly in the first category. The stones, emeralds of deep color, the central clusters substantial enough to command attention at distance, music, appeared regularly in photographs from state visits and high-visibility charitable events through the late 1980s and early 1990s. Diana wore the suite with a consistency that was itself a form of documentation. Each public appearance added another entry to the provenance. These stones photographed here on this date, worn by this woman at her deliberate choice. Some historians interpret this as unconscious habit, others read it as calculated repetition of possession. Both readings emerge from the same photographic evidence. Diplomacy, once received and worn long enough, becomes a settled thing. The photographic archive of Diana's public music. Appearances between 1989 and 1995 functions, when read against the documented timeline of the Wales marriage, as an involuntary diary. The emerald pieces appear with notable frequency during the periods of greatest recorded institutional pressure. In 1989 and 1990, as the marriage's difficulties became a subject of internal palace concern. In 1991, during the period in which Morton's interview recordings were being made, in the months surrounding the separation announcement of December 9, 1992, confirmed by Prime Minister John Major in the House of Commons, and again in 1993 and 1994, as the legal process of untangling a royal marriage with no modern precedent moved forward. The physical circumstance of wearing the emerald choker matters here. Unlike the formal tiaras and ceremonial necklaces of the state calendar, which required a dresser and frequently a second pair of hands, the choker's reconfigured clasp was manageable alone. This was not incidental to its alteration. The redesign had deliberately reduced the ceremony required to wear it, making it a piece Diana could put on in a private apartment without assistance, without the institutional choreography that surrounded almost every other aspect of her public presentation. A lady-in-waiting fastening a clasp is a small act of institutional participation. The absence of a lady-in-waiting is its own declaration. Museum conservators who have handled the piece note its relative lightness for its visual presence. Emeralds of this quality carry density, but the gold setting is finely worked, balancing display with wearability. Click of cold gold meeting its catch, heard only by the person wearing it music, in a room where no one watched, that sound was in its own precise way a complete sentence. Weight worn deliberately is weight controlled. The formal announcement of the separation between Charles and Diana came on December 9, 1992. What followed, through 1993, 1994, music, and into 1996, was a parallel negotiation conducted largely outside public view. The systematic classification and division of Diana's jewelry holdings. It was, by any measure, an unusual exercise in institutional archaeology, an attempt to draw clear lines through a collection accumulated over 15 years under conditions where clarity had rarely been in anyone's institutional interest. The framework applied, as documented in accounts from legal and biographic sources of the period, distinguished broadly between three categories. The first, pieces held as part of the royal collection and loaned to Diana in her capacity as Princess of Wales, which would be returned. The second, pieces given to her directly as personal diplomatic gifts, music, which were legally her own under prevailing convention. The third, pieces from the Spencer family inheritance, which had never been crown property and were not subject to negotiation. Music Spencer family solicitors and palace representatives worked through multiple drafts of an accounting during this period. Where the two inventories agreed, the process moved forward. Where they diverged, over pieces whose origins had been allowed to remain ambiguous during the marriage, discussions followed. The settlement, formalized as part of the divorce agreement completed on August 28, 1996, confirmed Diana's personal possession of the Saudi Emerald music suite. The status of the choker, which Diana had substantially altered, required its own resolution. The alteration itself had changed what was being accounted for. Both parties ultimately acknowledged this. What was recorded in the final agreement has not been made fully public by either family. Inventories tell partial truths. They document most precisely what someone chose to name and what someone else chose in the end not to contest. To commission an alteration to a piece of jewelry is, in the world of royal adornment, a deliberate declaration. To alter is to claim. The piece that emerges from an alteration carries the same stones, but wears a new biography, different Romans 6. Jewel identity, different relationship to the body wearing it, and a revised position in any documentary record. The reconfiguration of an emerald necklace into the choker form Diana wore to the White House in 1985 and to dozens of subsequent engagements across a decade is the most significant of her documented alterations. The original necklace, a formal configuration designed in the Edwardian tradition of the Cambridge Sweets Commission period, and its precise original construction not fully detailed in publicly available primary records, was substantially reduced and refitted with a closer, shorter band. The pendant clusters were reworked, the remaining stones were reset. Music, the visual and wearable result, was a transformation from ceremonial weight to personal precision. The altered piece no longer read as a crown necklace in the Edwardian tradition. It read as something contemporary, individual, belonging to the woman wearing it rather than to the institution she represented. Contemporary documentation, from biographic sources of the early 1990s notes, that Diana commissioned several such personal alterations during this period, reflecting a broader pattern of reclaiming her wardrobe, jewelry, clothing, public engagements, from institutional prescription. Accounts from those who assisted her during this period describe a woman making deliberate, considered choices about what she wore and in what form. A jeweler who resets a stone rewrites its history. The choker that emerged was, legally and visually, something Diana had made her own. To reset music, a stone is to rewrite its history. Within Diana's jewelry collection, a distinct subset music existed entirely outside the palace's institutional reach. Pieces inherited through the Spencer family that belonged to a history predating her marriage by generations. These were not diplomatic music gifts, not royal collection loans, not pieces accumulated in her capacity as Princess of Wales. They were the jewelry of a private family passing through a maternal line, carrying the particular quality of objects that had never been institutional property and never required the palace's permission to exist. Frances Shand Kidd, Diana's mother, retained Spencer family pieces that passed to her children through the conventional routes of private inheritance. Music, among Diana's documented personal jewelry, items with traceable Spencer family provenance appear in probate records and biographic sources from this period as straightforwardly personal. Their legal status was never genuinely contested during the separation negotiations because no one on either side had any reasonable basis to dispute it. Diana's documented attachment to the Spencer inheritance pieces was noted in correspondence and accounts from those close to her during the 1990s. They were worn at personal occasions rather than state ones, carried without ceremony rather than catalogued for institutional display. Their relative absence from the formal photographic record reflects their function, not armor against institutional pressure, but continuity with a lineage the palace had no access to. They were the jewelry of her own history, carried alongside the diplomatic emeralds and the altered choker as a quiet reminder of a life that had never entirely belonged to the crown. Some stones were never the palace's to ask for. Both parties understood this. The silence on the matter was not tension, but simple acknowledgement. In the final summer of her life, the photographic record shows Diana moving through the south of France and Paris with a jewelry selection considerably more personal and informal than the ceremonial assemblies of her earlier public career. Formally divorced since August 28, 1996, she was navigating the compressed freedom and uncertainty of a status the palace had no precedent for managing. The institutional armor, the emerald choker worn before White House state dinners, the Saudi suite for the formal diplomatic audiences was not present in the visual record of these final weeks. The pieces documented in photographs from July and early August 1997 are smaller, warmer. Rings, simple bracelets, items from the personal inheritance collection that needed no institutional occasion to justify their presence. The choker was elsewhere. In London, in the organized storage she maintained at Kensington Palace for pieces not currently in active use. On August 31, 1997, Diana died in Paris. The formal accounting of her estate began within weeks. Spencer estate probate music documentation, prepared through the autumn of 1997, recorded her jewelry holdings with care, establishing provenance categories that match the framework developed during the 1996 divorce settlement. The emerald music, choker, and the Saudi suite were listed as personal property of the estate to be held in trust for her sons. What the documentation did not, and could not contain, was any account of the laws. Tea time, the choker had been music, fastened in whatever room, by whatever hands, before whatever occasion. That moment exists only in its absence from the record. The last inventory is always someone else's task. The stone waits music, in its velvet case, for what comes next. In the years following Diana's death, the Royal Collection published several surveys of jewelry held in institutional trust, accompanied by scholarly catalog essays documenting provenance, music acquisition history, and current custodial status. These catalogs were thorough by institutional standards. They were also, in carefully observed ways, selectively incomplete. The Cambridge Emerald Choker did not appear in the Royal Collection's catalogued holdings through the late 1990s and into the 2000s because it was not there to document. It was in the Spencer estate held for Diana's sons. The catalog's silence on the piece was not an archival error. It was an accurate reflection of institutional reality. What had been Diana's was no longer the Royal Collection's to record. The Spencer family's position, maintained through estate representatives and selective disclosure to researchers and biographers, was consistent. The jewelry Diana retained was legally and unambiguously hers. The palace's choice not to engage publicly with specific pieces, to issue no clarifying inventory, address no question about particular stones, reflected an institutional preference for administrative quiet over documentary engagement. Royal archives do not generally contain entries for objects they do not hold. In archival practice, the absence of a record communicates as precisely as its presence. Music, what an institution declines to catalog, tells its own kind of documented story. The blank space in the Royal Collection's accounting of Diana's emeralds communicates a documented fact that the pieces were elsewhere by legal right and deliberate choice. The silence is informative. It simply declines to expand upon itself. The Spencer estate held Diana's personal jewelry in formal trust for her sons following her death. The arrangement preserved the collection in its entirety, with pieces designated to pass forward to the women in William's and Harry's lives, a wish Diana had expressed through her estate representatives and documented in the formal structure of the trust. When Prince William married Catherine Middleton at Westminster Abbey on April 29, 2011, he gave her Diana's sapphire and diamond engagement ring, the most publicly recognized piece in Diana's personal collection, confirmed by Clarence House at the time of the engagement announcement in November 2010. In subsequent years, Catherine appeared at formal state occasions wearing the emerald choker, music its appearance consistent with the documented Spencer estate pieces that passed to William following Diana's death. The piece had traveled from Queen Mary's consolidation of the Cambridge collection through Diana's reconfiguration and legal retention to its current wearer. 3 women across 3 generations, 1 continuous object, 3 entirely different institutional relationships to the same stones. The clasp Diana had fastened alone in a private room with no lady-in-waiting present was now being fastened by someone else at occasions the palace had arranged with the full ceremony of institutional sanction restored. The gold was the same, the weight was the same, the meaning was not. At their wedding in May 2018, Meghan wore Diana's aquamarine ring at the evening reception, among pieces from Diana's personal estate that Harry had inherited through the Spencer Trust, each stone carrying provenance the palace had once contested and the Spencer family had simply held. Inheritance is the last form of choice a woman can make about what she has carried. Diana made hers in the documentation of her estate precisely. The Cambridge Emerald Choker appears today on documented occasions in official royal family photographs accompanying Catherine, Princess of Wales. It is maintained, cleaned, worn correctly within the restored grammar of institutional ceremony. The gold setting catches light with the same patience that old metal has always brought to new occasions, indifferent to succession, responsive only to the angle of illumination and the warmth of the hands that fasten music. Between appearances, the choker rests in its case. The velvet interior holds the piece in the configuration of Diana's alteration, not the original necklace form from the Cambridge Collection's Edwardian Commission, but the shorter band she redesigned, the shape that made it possible to fasten alone. Music. The clasp waits in the position she would have recognized. Museum conservators who have examined the piece describe the emerald's quality as exceptional. The Colombian origin evident in the saturation and depth of color. The cut designed to hold light rather than throw it. The stone does not announce itself. It accumulates presence quietly as objects do when they have witnessed enough. What the record does not contain is any account of the particular morning when Diana stood before a mirror music at Kensington Palace and fastened the clasp herself. Alone, before an engagement the palace had not arranged for her and did not entirely approve. That moment exists only in the photographic consequence. Green stones against pale skin, worn with a steadiness that came from having chosen privately and without ceremony to wear them at music all. The velvet case is open. The light falls the same way it always has. The stone has outlasted everything said about it.